Yeah, I'm Brandon Weston. I own a collective of online articles and research and all sorts of stuff called Ozark Healing Traditions. If you're interested in anything to do with Ozark folkways, but specifically Ozark folk healing and magic traditions, you can check out my website at ozarkhealing.com. So today I'm going to be talking about the book I just wrote. And here's the book, Ozark Folk Magic, Plants, Prayers, and Healing. This has been a really a project a long time in the works for me. I started the research that would become this project in probably 2011, 2012. I wanted to travel around the Ozarks and find out for myself where the magical traditions, where the healing traditions, the folkways, folk beliefs, where they were today. I grew up amongst Ozark people. My family is from the hills, and I'm a multi-generational Ozarker from pretty far back. And so I grew up with a lot of these interesting traditions, traditions that not all of my friends had. So we had, stories in our family that probably a lot of you are familiar with. Every summer when I was a kid, I'd be outside playing in the woods, and my grandpa would always warn me about the hoop snake, which, if you don't know what the hoop snake is, it's an Ozark creature that supposedly can bite its own tail and roll like a wagon wheel across the ground, and it'll chase after you. And my grandpa always said that if it caught up with you, it would spit poison in your eyes. And so you had to be very careful and be on the lookout for these things. I also had healers in my family. I had, people who told a lot of stories about going and visiting folk healers. My grandma used to tell a story about when she was little, she had this terrible rash on her feet. And so her parents took her to what she called a witch woman in the hills. And she went in, and the woman didn't give her any herbal medicines, didn't put anything on her. She just waved her hands over her feet and said some words, and overnight the rash healed. So I grew up with a lot of these stories that I never thought were weird. I just thought it was a part of my family. But when I started college, I was in a folklore class here at the U of A. And I picked up a copy of Vance Randolph's Ozark Magic and Folklore, which is probably the most well-known book of Ozark folklore still in print. And as soon as I started reading through his work, so many just light bulbs started going off in my mind. And I finally realized that the traditions, the practices, the stories that I grew up with weren't just limited to my family, but they fit into this larger tapestry of Ozark folk belief. And at that time, I didn't know really much about the Ozarks apart from what, we learned in history classes and geography. I knew about the Ozark Mountains. I knew about, these different sort of plateau areas, things like that. I knew about the Ozark Folk Center, but I never really knew that I was a part of this culture. I never really knew that my family was a part of this culture, and that there was something here. There was something deeper than just the surface level stuff. And anybody from the Ozarks, you will know that a lot of the surface level stuff talked about, about the Ozarks is, that we're all uneducated, we're all shoeless hillbillies, all of this other stuff that has been passed around, the past 100 years at least. And so Vance Randolph's work really put me on an interesting path. From discovering his work, I wanted to find out what the other folklorists had to say. So I went to special collections at the university. I looked through everything that Vance Randolph had that Mary Celestia Parler had, that Otto Ernest Rayburn had, all of these Ozark folklorists. And then I realized something as I was looking through all of this work. So Ozark Magic and Folklore, Vance Randolph's most famous book and most popular book, still in print, it was first published in 1947. And so as I was reading all of this stuff, it was almost as if the information stopped in the 50s, the 60s. And so I desperately wanted to find out stuff about, where the Ozarks are now. Are these traditions still around? Are these practices still around? But I couldn't find anything. And so apart from, history, but all of these other folk practices, healing traditions, they were all left out of the story. So what I did was I went out on my own. I started collecting stories from my family. I started collecting stories from people my family knew, and I worked out from there. And eventually I ended up taking, I don't know how many trips around the Arkansas Ozarks and Missouri Ozarks, and just going around collecting all sorts of folk beliefs. I haven't just collected things surrounding healing and magic, but those are my real focus areas. I've collected all sorts of other things, foodways, recipes, things like that. And what I started to discover was that specifically Ozark folk healing and folk magic practices are not existing in the same way that they were for Vance Randolph. Those generations, unfortunately, have died off. And a lot of those healers, a lot of those practitioners, they died without being able to pass down a lot of this information. So what I found was that a lot of people are still working in a traditional way with methods that they've pieced together from family, methods that they've put together from working with other more traditional healers. But a lot of the way the traditional practitioners or the modern practitioners today work is in these eclectic ways. And it's so interesting to look at, because if we look back in Ozark history, Ozark people have always been eclectic. They've always used what they could find on the land, use what they could grow, use what they could take from their homes. We are a creative people in a lot of different ways, and our ingenuity just really knows no bounds in some ways. And so what I found amongst healers specifically is that people were working within this sort of traditional framework of healing and magic, working with this very strong connection to the land, which is very important in Ozark healing practices and magic practices, this connection to this sort of inborn magic within the world around us, this connection to the power of divine forces or spiritual forces, this connection to this idea of simplicity, this idea that magic and healing, this gift, as it's sometimes referred to, this power is at its, I guess, simplest, in its simplest form, is just the relationship between the person with the gift and the world around them, how they manipulate that magic in the world. And so even today, amongst modern healers, you don't find a lot of people buying specialized tools for their practice or using plants that they can't find or grow. The traditions of Ozark healing and magic are still very tightly ingrained with this sense of simplicity and this sense of connection to this place, to this land. Because traditionally, and for a lot of modern Ozarkers, the land itself is this very powerful source of not just magic, but this powerful source of healing. A lot of the, I guess, philosophy or the theory behind these practices comes from the hill folks' need for survival. So get to my next slide. Here's the Ozarks. This is the region that we're talking about. And the first people that really settled into the Ozarks after the forced removal of the Osage during the Indian Removal Act were from Appalachia. They were hill folk families and small clans from the Appalachian Mountains, mostly Tennessee, Kentucky, northern Georgia, places like that. They would have been from mostly Scots-Irish, but also German backgrounds, also mixed with indigenous peoples, specifically peoples of the Southeast, like Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Yuchi, Coasati, Shawnee. So it was already this amalgam of cultures, lots of practices going around, folk magic and healing practices that were carried with people from Europe, mixed with plant knowledge that we got from the indigenous peoples, and then a whole lot of other practices that developed in isolation in the Appalachian Mountains. So in the early 1800s, when the land was opened up after the removal of the Osage, people came into the Ozarks, and what they found here was a very familiar landscape. If anybody's been out to the Appalachians, you know that in a lot of ways, the Ozarks and the Appalachians, we are, sister cultures and sister landscapes. So what they found was a home. They found a land that they knew how to farm, they knew how to survive on. And so they came and they settled as small family groups mostly. And then those family groups sort of grew together and formed into communities. But folk practices, specifically healing practices and magic practices, have always, it doesn't matter what culture you're talking about, have always developed from a sense of need and urgency. They always develop as a way for the individual to respond to a harsh environment. And so the Ozark people that came to this area, they would have already had a huge body of knowledge. And when they got here, then as these sort of isolated groups, those practices evolved and changed and grew and incorporated plants that we have here that weren't in the Appalachians. They incorporated other folk beliefs, the landscape, things like that. And they've just continued to grow and evolve. Here's a map of the Appalachian region. So a lot of people don't know that the Appalachian Mountains that extend up into Pennsylvania. So in the Ozarks, we actually have a great deal of Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch influence on our healing and magic practices. And this is because Pennsylvania German people moved into the northern Appalachian Mountains and then moved south and eventually over to the Ozarks. So a lot of the folk practices that I've collected, you can trace back to very similar sources amongst Pennsylvania German people today. You can trace them all the way back to some European sources. So there are certain verbal charms that we use in the Ozarks that I've collected that you can find exact examples of these verbal charms from medieval Europe, where they're written in Latin, and it's almost a direct translation over. So it's kind of an amazing area to look at, and it's been such an underrepresented area for so long. When Vance Randolph wrote Ozark Magic and Folklore, he originally published the book under the title Ozark Superstitions. He wrote it as an academic book from an academic standpoint, as a way of helping to preserve Ozark folk culture, specifically to then publish to a wider audience. And still to this day, I use Vance Randolph's work, and I use the works of the other folklorists as well. They created such an important foundation for us. Without their works, I would have never been able to write this book. The practices would have died off so much earlier. And yeah, I don't like to think about where we would be without that foundation. But one of the main purposes for this book was being able to update the story. So being able to look and say, where are we today? Where are these practices today? Because what I found in my research and talking to lots of different Ozarkers, the Ozarks that Vance Randolph wrote about no longer exists, and we kind of hold on to it in a historical way. We hold on to it by sharing folkways, by sharing folk crafts, encouraging people to learn these folkways and involve themselves with this. But there's another part of the story as well. And that story is about healing. That story is about the practices that aren't so surface level, that are hard to collect, and that evolve rapidly. And that's kind of where I am. That's where I find my research is looking at those practices. And that's what's sort of gone to shape this book. Part of what's so difficult about pinning down Ozark practices, specifically healing and magic practices, is that they are so family-based. So whereas you might have a tradition that everybody in the community sort of knew and identified with, there may be different parts of it. We can think about like basket weaving or pottery, carving, things like that. There may be different variations, but there's basically the same sorts of techniques going around. That's not always the case with healing and magic practices. Folk healing, especially in the Ozarks, has always been family-based because of the isolation of the Ozark people pretty early on. And so from family to family, you can have vastly different practices, vastly different theories about healing. You can have one family that heals with very specific rituals, very specific prayers or plants that this one family uses. And then 3 miles away, you have another family that's doing something completely different, working in a completely different way. And so it was really hard for me collecting practices because I wanted to know, I guess I was under the misunderstanding that there had to be this set of beliefs. There had to be almost a user's manual for Ozark folk magic, that I just had to find it. And what I came to learn was that there is a real beauty, there is a real sophistication in having a system that is so based in traditions passed from one person to another, passed from within one family line or through these lineages. They may be based in family, or they may be based in non-blood family as well. So there's a real beauty in that, because it gives us all of these unique and interesting practices. It gives us different ways healers have viewed the natural world. There are some traditional healers that derive their gift from a connection to God, from their religion. They heal using Bible verses and prayers, traditional prayers, things like that. There are healers that derive their power, their magic gift from ancestors. So a connection to healers that have been in their family, that have passed, but they appear to them in visions or dreams to pass down these gifts. There are healers that work with the little people or the fairies of the Ozarks, and they derive their power from a relationship to these otherworldly beings and spirits of the land. So there's practices. We can't really say that, this isn't Ozark, but this is, because it's all kind of Ozark and it's all traditional. We have to rethink our way, how we consider things to be traditional. Because for so long we have been under the misunderstanding that tradition means this user's manual, this practice has always existed like this, and from the time it was created and has been passed down in the same way. No, that's not the case. Especially with healing traditions, healers change things always. But what I found that was really interesting was the people that still had connections to the sort of Ozark identity, they were operating with this core belief in this power of the landscape. Something about their connection to this place, to the Ozarks, and the sort of hidden or unseen forces that are in the landscape, that gave them some sort of power or knowledge, even if it was just in a basic sense of herbalism. People using yarbs, as we call them, these healing plants. They still had this understanding of a balance between the healing that they did with these plants and the ultimate thriving and surviving of the landscape. So I've met herbalists who didn't have a magical bone in their body. They worked in a very practical way with plants that were, whose uses were derived through empirical evidence, using them through multiple generations. They worked in what I would consider to be a scientific way with their plants. But every herbalist that I met that worked in that way, they still had traditions that helped keep the balance between them and the landscape together. And so one example, I met a herbalist who she had, and so she would only harvest certain numbers of plants from groups. And if there weren't, so if there was a group of 10 plants, she would only harvest 2. Or she, if there were only 5, she might not harvest any. And everywhere that we went harvesting these plants, she always left something behind. And usually it was a little piece of bread or food or something like that. And I asked her why she did that, because she wasn't particularly religious. She didn't have all these other beliefs. And she said that healing power always demands a sacrifice. And by leaving something of hers behind, she was able to maintain that balance with the world around her. And so as I talked with other healers that some of them didn't work with plants at all. And some of them only worked with prayers, or they, made talismans, amulets, they worked with ritual, things like that. As I talked with all of these different healers, I started to find this connection, this web. And at the center of this healing practice, this magic practice, was this very deep connection to that balance with the land, that balance with the unseen forces on the land, which includes spirits, ghosts, little people, and also this sort of balance between the individual and the divine, which is why a lot of the healers I've met have been very pious people. Traditionally, in the old days, when magic and witchcraft was really considered very close to devil work, like the fiddle, like we were talking about, witchcraft, anything to do with magic was seen as evil. It was seen as a practice specifically aimed at hurting people, stealing from people, harming people in the community. So in the old days, healers would often hide behind their piety so that they weren't accused of witchcraft, so that their practices, which were probably not aimed at hurting people, so that people, wouldn't suspect that their practices were something they weren't. But a lot of the healers I've met have been pious people, or not necessarily religious, but what I would consider to be very pious, in that they have this strong connection to this divine force. And in some cases, that divine force isn't, something that tangible. We can't really define it. Sometimes it's just been this magical force that exists within nature itself. One of my biggest inspirations for writing this book came from my own family. And this is my great uncle Bill. Uncle Bill was a wart charmer. He could actually buy warts, which is a very specific subsection of wart charming in Ozark folk healing. Whenever we were at family reunions or funerals, which was pretty much the only time we ever saw Uncle Bill, if you had a wart, you would go up and you'd say, "Uncle Bill, I've got a wart." and he would fish around in his pocket for some loose change, and he would give you a penny or a dime, and he'd say, well, I'll buy them off of you. And you always knew as a part of the ritual to say yes and take the money. And then overnight, your warts would disappear. And I've had warts cured this way. My family has had warts cured in this way. It was just kind of something that Uncle Bill did. And another one of these practices that growing up, I never thought anything of. I just thought it was weird Uncle Bill doing, what he did. But when I picked up Vance Randolph, he has a whole section on wart charmers in Ozark Magic and Folklore. And specifically, he mentions wart buyers. And so it was an amazing experience for me to be able to sit down and read Vance Randolph and to see practices from my own family represented there. It was a hugely validating experience for me as an Ozarker, especially coming from a background where not everybody I went to school with was from the hills, and there was a lot of making fun of the hill folk stereotype, the hillbilly stereotypes. And so for me, reading Vance Randolph, it was hugely validating for me. And through this whole process, talking to modern healers, modern practitioners has been, for me, a way of revitalizing my culture, revitalizing the practices that I grew up with, the practices that I've always loved and held dear. It's been a way for me to not only revitalize and help heal that for myself, but help heal it for other Ozarkers. One of the amazing things with this whole project has been getting in touch with people who have read the book and they've passed it through their families, and their grandparents have read it and things like that. And I don't know how many times people have contacted me and just said, thank you. You validated me as an Ozarker. You made me feel like I wasn't weird, that my family practices were perhaps worth saving, which is a big part of this project, is encouraging people to re-examine their own family practices, re-examine their own memories from when they were a child, interacting perhaps with the Ozark landscape or Ozark folk practices, and just sort of looking at those things not as silly memories or superstitions, things like that, but giving them a chance, looking at them, and looking and seeing what perhaps we can bring into the modern world, what we can keep for our children or grandchildren, what we can pass along to people, what we can write down or record of our memories or interactions with family, things like that. And so this project for me has been a deeply personal one. Originally, when I first started the project, it was going to be mostly a bibliography, a collection of what all the other folklorists said about certain subjects, and specifically healing practices and plants. And so I was going to just collect and compile, basically. And then I met a very, very nice healer that gave me a lot of really good information. And so I was talking to her about the book and why I was out in the hills collecting stuff. And she just kind of looked at me funny, and she said, well, you're a part of this too. And up until that point, I always considered myself a collector, a folklorist, an academic, sort of collecting these practices for preservation, but not for my own personal use. And it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And so I started thinking a little bit more about my interaction with my own culture, my interaction with this project. And it kind of dawned on me that I have some connection to this. I have something to bring to the table. So I started writing from a personal view, a personal viewpoint. My interactions with the Ozarks as not just an Ozarker, not just someone who grew up out in the hills, but as a healer, as someone who works with traditional practices and things like that for healing. So I started writing from a very personal, deeply personal perspective. And that's where we are with the book. I wouldn't say it's a historic work necessarily, but there is a lot of history in it. I'm not a historian, but I defer to the knowledge of people that are much better at history than me. And so there is history in it, but what you'll find is just a personal interaction with not only my own Ozark family ancestors, but my interaction with modern practitioners today. And like I said, modern practitioners are working in a very different way than people used to. And it's something that we really need to start talking about. For so long, the practices, specifically magic and folk healing, were not something that were readily talked about. So the big folklorists of the past that I mentioned, Vance Randolph was on the left there, and then also on the top left with Otto Ernest Rayburn. And then Mary Parler is in the bottom photo. She's actually married to Vance Randolph. And there's a running joke that he only married her for her folklore collection because it actually is a huge collection. So the folklorists laid a really good foundation. But even the folklorists, when they were talking about magical practices, healing practices, they did so with skepticism. They did so with this understanding that these were superstitions. The only real coverage about folk healing in the Ozarks that we've had have been lumped in with, studies about plants. So studies about the contained chemical compounds within certain healing plants, if these plants are actually worth anything, or if they actually can heal, things like that. So a lot of the research, and good research too, I encourage that sort of scientific look at herbalism, folk herbalism. But that's been the dominating story for so long. It's either been these really cool healing plants that people used to use, and over here are these weird superstitions, or they haven't been talked about at all, and they've just been sort of glossed over as things that hill folk believed but no longer do. And so where I kind of see myself is in shining a light on the practices that have been neglected, and those practices are specifically related to healing and magic, or healing in a way that doesn't necessarily involve making a tea from a certain plant and then giving it to somebody to drink. So what I'm really interested in is all the weird stuff, all of the, I want to know about the secret rituals that healers used to do. I want to know about, how people, made their healing medicines. Because in a lot of cases, it wasn't just pour boiling water over a plant. In most cases that I've collected anyway, healers always have rituals that they do. People will pray over their medicines. People will stir them a certain number of times, or stir them with a special spoon, a blessed spoon, things like that. So that was the stuff that I really wanted to know about. And that's the stuff that's really hard to get, because like I said, these traditions are based in family lineages. They're based in these sort of tight-knit bubbles, and it's kind of hard sometimes to get in there. But when I kind of took a step back and said, I need to be looking at this from the perspective of as an academic, but an Ozarker. When I started going into conversations, introducing myself as, hello, I'm Brandon Weston, my family's from the Ozarks, and I'm a healer, things changed for me. Things changed greatly. People opened up, because they weren't talking to an academic who was going to make money off of their stories. They were talking to a healer who wanted to help save these practices. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the people I met were, not long for this world. They were ready to pass something along because their children weren't interested, their grandchildren weren't interested. They had this knowledge, but they had no one to give it to. And so in a lot of ways, I was, helping to give them this gift of passing along their power. which is so important for the healer and has been traditionally. There's a folk belief that healers should never die with the power. And there's a couple different explanations about it. Some people say that, if it's a gift from God or if it's a gift from the divine, you shouldn't squander it. You should use it, and then you should pass it along because, it's a gift. It's not yours to keep. And then there's other people that have a little bit different take on it. A couple of healers I've met, they kind of carried a much older belief that the power, if you die with this power, it can actually corrupt your spirit. It can actually turn you into this ghost that will do opposite of everything you did in life. So if you healed in life, you would curse in the afterlife, things like that. And so, whether depending on which story you want to believe, either way, it is this idea that this knowledge is important, and it's knowledge that for whatever reason it works and it can help, and it needs to be passed down. It needs to be helped, and it needs to be saved. And so I was all too happy to be able to collect practices from people, especially those who didn't have anyone to pass them along to. So I've got a lot of that stuff. A lot of it went into the book, but there's so much more. One of the areas that I really like to focus on is helping to integrate the different sides of the healing process. So traditionally for Ozark people, there was no separation between healing the body and healing the spirit, or healing the mind, as we might say today. They both went hand in hand. So if you give somebody a medicinal tea or a home remedy, you also pray with them. You also, make sure while they're sick, their house gets cleaned, their children get taken care of, things like that, to help ease them through the healing process so they don't have to worry about it. A lot of our magical rituals are not really magical, they're psychological. Folk doctors have always had this tool bag of different methods and rituals and things. And one of those big things is folk psychology, is being able to relate to the person that you're healing and work with them to engage within their own healing process. And so that's a big section of this book, is examining how folk practices and folk healing methods can exist in the modern world where we have medicines for everything. So how do we interact with doctors? How do we interact with hospitals? Things like that. And that's a big area that I'm still researching, that I'm still looking into, and I hope to be able to do a lot more work with that in the future. I know some of the healers that I've met today, they have no problem working with the local doctor. I myself, as a healer, I always ask people before they come to me, have you talked to a doctor? Have you gone to a therapist? Have you done this? Because I'm happy to help, but we have medicines for a reason. We have very good medicines for a very good reason. And so if you want to engage with, the other side of healing, then sure, we can do that. But I always make sure that people also consider modern medicine as a part of their healing process. But I met one lady who, she had a very successful healing, I say business, it wasn't really a business because she didn't take money, she took donations, but some people would just drop off food, things like that. She never charged for her work, which is very common amongst Ozark healers. But the only thing that she did was people would bring her their prescription medications and she would pray over them. So she would sit and she would give each person their own devoted time and specific prayers and things like that. And then they would take the medicine and they would go back home. And she was much beloved in her community. People, they swore by her prayers. They always said that, taking the medicine before she prayed over it, it didn't work in the same way. It worked better. Or, in some cases, I talked to some people that, were taking medicines for arthritis and things like that. And they said that they were actually able to work off of the medicines because of her prayers. So she wasn't working against the modern medical establishment. She was working with it. She was working in a way that encouraged people. And this is the thing about Ozark Hill folk. It's in my family. It's in everybody's family. You know, we don't like going to the doctor. It's just a thing. And there's been this very deep-seated, long fear of medicine and the doctor. And so she was able to, in her community, get people to go to the doctor. And that for her was a triumph. That for her was a great thing. She was providing a cultural framework that was comforting for people to be able to heal. And the doctor, the local doctor, loved her as well, because, you know, in a lot of cases, the fight has been the country doctor against the healer, when in reality, it's much better if we work together with these practices. And that has been a huge influence on this book, and is continuing to influence my writings and research, is this: how do we work with these traditional practices in an evolving way? How do we work with them in a dynamic way? How do we bring them into the world today and leave behind some of the things that were harmful about these practices? How do we better these practices and work with, you know, sort of these ever continuing, ever evolving methods as well? So that's me. And here's where else to find me if you're interested. I am going to open it up for questions in the last 15 minutes here, if we have any. Again, you can find me at ozarkhealing.com. I do have a contact form or little page on my website if you have any questions or comments or want to bring something up. You can also, I do other events and lectures virtually, and I'm going to start doing more in-person stuff in the fall. But if you want to attend any of my other events, you can find them on the website as well. I do have a Facebook page, Ozark Healing Traditions, and then an Instagram at Ozark Healing Traditions. And yeah, the book, you can get it anywhere online. I think some Barnes and Nobles have it. Somebody said Books A Million has it. I know if you're local in Fayetteville, the Four of Wands has it. Two Friends Books up in Bentonville has it. Does the museum have it?
We are working toward, currently our museum store is closed because it's such a tiny area, but yes, our store manager is in the process of getting with your publisher and
Cool.
getting some copies. So yeah, we will be pleased to sell your book in our Shiloh Museum store.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you know, if you're from somewhere else and you've spotted it in a store, let me know, because I've been trying to collect where they are. I know Hot Springs, it's at the Parlor, which is a bookstore there. So yeah, if you're around and you happen to see it, send me a line, and I can send people towards it. But if you want to order it online, you can order it on Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble online, anywhere. So I'm actually going to go ahead and stop my share for questions, because it'll be a little bit easier for me to do that.
Are you so tech savvy that you can read your own questions in the chat, or you want me to field them and read them to you?
I could probably do it. Let's see.
Brandon, you're so amazing.
Okay, looks like the first question was from Sue. Do you have any sort of background in herbalism? So my remedies and folk healing. So I don't have any traditional training in herbalism. Herbalism isn't really a part of my healing practice. So I don't prescribe herbal medicines to people. I work more with the spiritual side of the healing process. But that said, I do know a lot about plants, specifically native Ozark plants, healing plants. And that is just from working with healers and, you know, carrying around really good guidebooks and just learning everything that I can about that. What was the title of Vance Randolph's book? So Vance Randolph wrote Ozark Magic and Folklore. If you just search for his name in Amazon, it'll pop up. There's most of the part of the problem with what the folklorists have written is none of it's in print anymore. So pretty much the only thing in print is Vance Randolph's Ozark Magic and Folklore, and one of his books of sort of dirty jokes called Pissing in the Snow. And so it's actually pretty good. But yeah, so a lot of what is from the folklorist is really hard to find. And that was kind of a driving force for me to not only write about modern practices, but also make a book that's available because it's so hard to find. And like I said, Vance Randolph didn't write from a practitioner standpoint. So whenever he was recording folk practices and things like that, a lot of it I know for a fact he got wrong, misinterpreted, and in some cases just made up. So keep that in mind when you're reading Vance Randolph. But all of the folklorists created a really nice foundation for us to work from today. There's a link to my book. Let's see. Did my uncle pass on his talent to anyone in the family? If so, who and how? So to my knowledge, he didn't. To my knowledge, he died with that power, which is really sad because I didn't know he did. Well, I mean, I interacted with him as a kid. I didn't know it was something worth saving until he was already gone. And so that's another really sort of driving force for collecting family stories. Don't wait until you're going to, regret not collecting something. There's so much more that I wish I would have collected from him. After I came out with this book, his daughter actually contacted me and said, did you know that Dad could also stop blood from a bleeding wound, which is a traditional form of Ozark healing with certain prayers and charms and things. And he also used to always work with the signs of the moon and the zodiac. So these signs are said to be able to influence when you plant, when you cut your hair, all sorts of stuff. And he used to do that. And I didn't know that. And so there's so much that I wish I could have collected from him. But unfortunately, I wasn't interested in it until it was too late. Let's see. Say more about the eclecticism that you brought up at the beginning of the talk. Okay, so the Ozark has seen a lot of times of tumultuous change. And one of those times was in the 60s and 70s with the Back to the Land movement. And so what that brought in was communities of people, mostly from outside the Ozarks, who were exposed to very different traditions. In particular, one area that I've been studying is specifically people that were a part of the New Age movement. So these communities that were, they had exposure to other traditions like Wicca, modern witchcraft traditions, yoga, different medicines, Ayurvedic medicine from India, Chinese traditional medicine, and they brought all of this stuff with them into the rural Ozarks. And in a lot of ways, there was very, very often violent tension between these two communities. But what I found was over the years, these practices sort of diffused into the community in some way. Not in a huge way, but in the modern world, diffusion through the internet and through exposure to all of this stuff is, very large. I met a group in one rural town that I went to. There was a yoga group that I never would have thought I would have seen in a rural town, but things like that. But pretty early on, the people that were a part of the sort of New Age movement, their practices diffused into the Ozark community. A couple of specific examples: I met an older healer who was an herbalist and knew every plant in the woods. All you had to do was point at it and he could tell you what it was and what it did. But he worked with completely according to Chinese traditional weights and measurements, and also Chinese traditional healing theory. So with there are different things like qi energy and spleen and different things. Most of the traditional Ozark healers have worked in a more European way. By that, I mean the four humor system. So, sanguine, yellow bile, choleric, things like that, which is very common in folk practices that originate in Europe. But he worked from this Chinese perspective, and I asked him about where that came from, because he learned his plants from his grandma, who I know didn't work in that way. And he said back in the 70s, when he was, starting to do his own plant healing and stuff, he picked up a couple books on Chinese traditional medicine that were in a local bookshop, and he incorporated that into his practice because he thought it worked better than the system his grandma gave to him. And there's lots of examples like that of people picking up certain practices and incorporating it in. There's also a generational divide. So people that are a part of my generation, the millennials, stuff like that, people that are magical practitioners in these generations are much more likely to be influenced by modern witchcraft practices and traditions. So, in the old Ozarks, people typically didn't use tarot cards, things like that, crystals, in their healing practices, but you see a lot more of that. And I'm not opposed to any of that, because I think it's all a part of this modern evolving practice. And what excites me is that even through all of this stuff, people are now getting more and more interested in Ozark traditions, and they're bringing those into their practices, and they're bringing those into their work. And so my role, I encourage all evolution and change, as long as it is ultimately beneficial and helping people. But then, of course, I encourage people to consider bringing in some Ozark practices too, some traditional Ozark practices, because in a lot of ways they work very well with other folk practices. Let's see. What is your gift? What do you mean by the spiritual side? Have you had any successful healings? So a lot of what I do is working with people to engage them into their own healing process. And so I work with traditional methods that include certain prayers, verbal charm. I work with charms. I work with a lot of ritual, and a lot of that is to help people engage with healing. So one ritual that I might do for somebody is taking them out to a creek or a river and giving them a cleansing wash in the river, which is very traditional Ozark practice. Sometimes it's you use different plants to wash them, things like that, but it's a way for a person to be cleansed or purified of sickness, curses, hexes, things like that. A lot of what I do is just formulating rituals for people's specific problems, for their conditions. And really a big part of my role is getting people to think about their situations in maybe a different way. And so have I had any successful healings? Yes. But I mean, you kind of have to, what do you mean by healing? Traditionally, there have been lots of people that have claimed to heal cancer, to heal all sorts of things. Like I said, I rely fully on modern medicine to solve a lot of these issues. What I see my role as is almost as a counselor to help people that don't necessarily just want to do the physical medicine. They also want to help heal their spirit or their mind, or just engage in the process in a little bit different way. So that's kind of what I do. It's kind of complicated, but it's also simple at the same time. At the end of the day, what I do is I work with people, I talk with people, we work out what exactly they're looking for, and then we come up with maybe some rituals or some things that they can do to help engage with the healing process. One last question here. Does the tradition of using madstones exist in the Ozarks? Yeah, absolutely. So madstones, you don't see them much anymore. I've actually never seen a physical one. Traditionally, they're actually bezoars, which are calcium and mineral deposits that form within the stomachs of cud-chewing animals. So animals that chew their own cud will form these stones in their stomach. And traditionally, people would find them when they were slaughtering cows or deer, these other animals. They would find them, and they were called madstones. And they were used for curing rabies, and also I've seen some or heard of some for curing snake bite, the venom in the snake bite. But basically, what they would do is they would keep the stone, and if a person was bit by a mad dog, they would place the stone on the wound for a certain amount of time, and sometimes they would accompany it with certain prayers. And then they would put the stone in a liquid, usually milk, and the milk would drain the poison out of the stone. And in some stories, Vance Randolph talks about it a lot, but in some of the stories I've heard, they say that, when you put it in the milk turns green with the poison. So they would do something very similar with snake bites. They would put the madstone on the snake bite, and it would draw out the venom, and then they would put it in a cleansing liquid of some sort, usually milk, but sometimes water as well. So yeah, that's a big tradition in the Ozarks. But like I said, it's one of those traditions that's kind of died off. You do find some people around that have them, but yeah. So Danielle Shelton said that volunteer at Shiloh used to have a madstone. Yeah, that she used in her reenactments. You can actually you can buy bezoars. They are actually used in Chinese traditional medicine, the bezoar stones. But yeah, so you can find them around. I personally have never seen them in a traditional setting. I've never seen somebody actually use them, but I have heard stories. So somebody would be like, my grandpa used to have one, something like that. Water witchers, dowsers. That's a big practice in the Ozarks, not just for water. So the dowsers, for people that don't know, were people that could use usually sticks, either in an L shape or a Y shape, and they were able to find underground streams of water. Specifically, they were used to dig wells, things like that. And so for some people, it's supernatural power, but for some people, it's completely natural. I've met dowsers that say anybody can do it. You don't have to have a gift. So there's some spookiness around it. No one quite knows how it works. Some are very successful, some are not. But just in closing, there are also traditionally dowsers for other things as well. So there are people that can find treasure, buried treasure, or one of my favorites is there are grave dowsers. So people that will go out and find lost cemeteries. They can actually douse or be able to magically find dead bodies under the ground. So, all right. So thank you all again for attending. I always love talking at the Shiloh Museum. I love the Shiloh Museum. I have very fond memories. I grew up in Springdale, and going to the Shiloh Museum as a field trip for me was like top notch. I always loved doing that. And still do love going. I'm looking forward to being able to go back inside and look around and all that. So